Yesterday, I mentioned this on the air. I got a note from the sister, one of the sisters of Michael Hutchison, an old friend of mine, that he had passed away the night before last. And I really sort of got in touch with dying when I sat with my father as he died. It was the first time I'd ever actually been with a person dying. And he died a pretty awful death. He was in a lot of pain. But there was this sense that I had of liberation for him at the moment he died. And part of that, or a large part of that, my dad died in 2006, was informed by conversations that I had had back in 2002, 2003, I forget the year, in the late 90s, early 2000s, with Michael Hutchison. Michael had been a friend of mine for at least a decade at that point in time. He wrote Megabrain in 1986, which was a book that just revolutionized the whole way that we view how brains work and the ability to expand the power of our brain. And then he wrote Megabrain Power in 1991, and he wrote in 84, his first book actually was about floating, sensory deprivation tanks. It was called The Book of Floating, and which I had tried a number of times as a consequence of having read Michael's book back in the 80s. And I loved. I just, you can't have a flotation tank on a boat, but so anyhow, Michael and I were friends, and Michael and Louise and I used to go out to Santa Fe and hang out with Michael, and we've stayed at his home, and he used to do these workshops where people would come in and try out brain machines and things, and we'd been there. And whenever this happened, I'm sorry I don't have the date for this, but in the 2000s, Michael talks about what happened. He actually did an interview that you can find. It's titled An Interview with Michael Hutchison. It's Hutchison. Usually there's an N, Hutchinson, but it's not. There's a Hutchison over at thomhartmann.com. You can easily Google it. And he says, I got hit by this is an interview he did with one of the brain magazines. And he says, I got hit with a quadruple whammy. One February night, I woke up and the house was filled with black smoke. His house was on fire. And his office, basically the house went down. In fact, he went down. He was overcome by the smoke. The only reason the firemen were able to find his body and he was still alive, was because they had just bought this new infrared or ultraviolet or whatever sensor, and they found him and they took him out of the house. But the house burned down. And he lost everything. He lost his manuscripts. He lost his computers. He was in the middle of working on a brand new book on consciousness, and everything was gone. And in fact, he says it was just amazing luck that my neighbor had been awake at 2 a.m. to see that. And then he says, after I got out of the hospital, I was staying with a friend, and I went for a run. I got caught in a snowstorm. I was heading for home, crossing a footbridge across the Santa Fe River, and I slipped on an ice patch and fell head over heels a long distance down the rocky riverbed. My neck and the back of my head smashed into the rocks. Basically, I was lucky I didn't get killed in the fall, but I broke my spine. I was laying there in the icy waters, paralyzed from the neck down, with only my face out of the water. I knew I was paralyzed. I couldn't call for help because I couldn't breathe. Well, somebody saw him. They got him to the hospital. He passed out there. They got him to the hospital, and he spent the rest of his life essentially paralyzed from the neck down. So he tells the story of this. He had run out of money, didn't have any health insurance. He said, so when the time came for me to leave the hospital, there was no place to go, and he was put in this very grim nursing home. He says it was dark, noisy, overcrowded, the hallways jammed with sickly, frail people, mainly in their 80s and 90s, vegetating in wheelchairs or just milling around, many of them with advanced Alzheimer's. It was basically a warehouse for old people waiting to die. So here I was, confined mostly to the inside of this cuckoo's nest, where people were wandering around, shouting, screaming, yelling for help. The screaming never let up, he wrote. Amazingly, many people screamed right up to the moment they died. The inmates would wander into my room and lay down on my bed with me or take my clothes and books. I remember being very frustrated with these Alzheimer's patients because I couldn't do anything to stop them from laying beside me or taking my things. I was too paralyzed. He says it was like something out of Dante's Inferno. And he says, I came to a place where I thought my life was over. I remember thinking, I still feel young, but I can't move. I'm a writer, but I can't move my hands. I can't write. I'm a father, but I'm not with my son. I'm a thinker, but I can't think clearly. I'm a lover, but I can't make love. I had to face it. This was real life. And then, after some weeks or months there, he said, at some point it became clear to me, the way muddy water gets clear when you let it sit still for a while, that I was facing a big decision. And then it really hit me that I had to do in a serious way what I had been writing about in the new book that I had been working on. I had to truly live some of the spiritual processes that I had been exploring before the accident. This was no intellectual exercise, no book. This was real life. Before the accident, I had been fascinated with the idea of spiritual awakening. Now I realized I had to go beyond the idea. I saw clearly that truly awakening was my only way out. The only way out was in. I decided that I would look on being confined to this nursing home as the equivalent to undergoing an intensive retreat in a Zen monastery. And then he talks about how he says it was so obvious. Now I realized that I had to continue this work on my own. It was so obvious, but it had taken the destruction of my entire life to see it. I'd always wanted to spend time in a Zen monastery, so I decided to look at being confined there in a wheelchair as being confined to a monastery or a retreat. I started spending many hours every day, 8, 10, 12 hours, doing intense meditation. My main focus of meditation was to attain pure emptiness, the no-mind state, the void, God. With all the shouting and the screams of the people and people wandering around, I had to shut down my hearing, so I wasn't paying attention to it. Much of the time, my roommate would have the TV playing, so I had to ignore that, too. I closed my eyes. Months passed. And I had some very interesting experiences, Michael writes. Visions, images, floods of white light, movies in my head, thoughts, ideas. It was not enlightenment, though. These were all things. The products of my mind and the forms of the world are all things. The ancient masters are very clear about this. After months of frustration, he writes, it began to hit me. The voice in my head said, let go, man, let go. What do you think life's telling you? All these near-death experiences? What do you think that's all about? Dying, that's what. You keep hanging on to life like you're afraid to let go. It's time to die. Michael wrote, or for this, told the person who was interviewing him for this magazine. He said, I realized, and he's shared this story with me in virtually the same words. He said, I realized my ego, which is to say myself, was holding on, was trying to maintain control, trying to remain in existence. I knew it was the time for the ego to let go. It was like my entire being had been clenched in a tight fist. And suddenly the fist opened up and let go completely. Everything dropped away. All contractions released and disappeared. Contraction of the mind, of the body, of the emotions. Everything's a contraction, even thinking. Just at this point, they came to take me for a shower. They wheeled me down the hallway and hosed me off, and for a time I forgot about meditating and seeking. As they wheeled me back to my room, I suddenly found things begin to happen. At first, it was radiance within me. I began seeing and experiencing this upwelling or emanation. It was in front of my eyes, but also inside my eyes and inside my body. This radiance began flowing upward. It was like a spring welling up, but it was welling up out of infinite emptiness. It was emptiness, the void, but it was luminous. As this continued to happen, I realized it was bliss. It was just a current of bliss. Over the next few hours, it became more and more intense. As the days went by, I began to realize I was existing in a sea of bliss, which we would call consciousness or spirit. Everything around me was bliss. The simple beingness of being was bliss. It was fun to be alive, every moment. Even though I was having a lot of pain and was paralyzed and stuck in this grim cuckoo's nest, no matter what my external condition was, there was still this intrinsic joy at being alive. So my friend Michael Hutchison passed away 2 days ago, author of Megabrain and Megabrain Power. Very proud of his son, survived by his sisters, Suzanne, Lucinda, Callie, the son of Adele and Russell S. Hutchison. Good man. And he's talking about this experience that he had after he was paralyzed from the neck down in this nursing home, in this hellish nursing home, where he just, after weeks, months and months actually, of just meditating and relaxing and trying to let go, he finally did. He just completely let go. He said, as the days went by, I began to realize I was existing in a sea of bliss, what we would call consciousness or spirit. Everything around me was bliss. The simple beingness of being was bliss. It was fun to be alive. Every moment. I was experiencing being like a fish swimming in water, suddenly realizing that he's in the water. I had this sensation of bliss or consciousness as being some transparent, invisible, all-pervasive substance that surrounded and permeated and interpenetrated everything in the world. And I was swimming in it. We all are, all the time, even though we don't know it. Everything that happened in that bliss was totally effortless. I realized I wasn't doing my life, but that I was being lived through by consciousness. I wasn't breathing, I was being breathed through by consciousness. I wasn't thinking, I was being thought through. I wasn't seeing, I was being seen through. When you look at it this way, everything is happening just the way it is. Everything is perfect, just the way it is. You don't need to worry about anything, because whatever is going to happen, happens. There's nothing you can do about it, so just sit back and let it happen, because it's all going to anyway. My assumption had been, Michael writes, that peak experiences were rare events, like precious jewels in the ordinary muck of life. Now it became clear to me that this kind of awakening, of being lived through by consciousness, was not a peak experience per se. It wasn't rare. It wasn't even really an experience. It was just the condition of being, the nature of reality, the primary innermost essence. Far from being rare, this pure consciousness is always here, always the same, never changes, never moves, and is constantly going on, no matter what experiences you may be having. You could have an experience of pain, and this consciousness would still be here. You could have an experience of carrying on a conversation, and the consciousness is still here. You have it every instant of your life, every moment of your life, but you're just not aware of it. In fact, once you become aware of it, you can't make it go away. It's like watching a movie. You know, your attention is on the images on the screen is always there, and once you notice the screen or the images go away, it's like you get rid of everything that's a thing. What's left? What's left is consciousness, or absolute awareness. Once I recognized it, this experience was very familiar to me, because I had had it all my life. Actually, it's not an experience, it's prior to experience. When you have an experience, there's someone there having the experience. In pure consciousness, the one who experiences goes away. One way I can describe it is that time disappears. That's the bliss I'm talking about. When time disappears, you're in a place where there's no inside and no outside, no center, no edge, no before, no after, no past, no future, just now. This space is essentially formless, limitless, and very clear, open, empty, alive, and still. Radiant and alive, but totally still. A paradox, but that's what it is. It was just bliss, or pure consciousness, or God. This primordial awareness is reality. It's totally real, totally natural, effortless, and closer to you than your own breath. I remember Michael saying that to me the first time he said it to me on the phone, and I caught my own breath and thought, wow, you know, as I'm being breathed through. In fact, it's not me, it's consciousness, and this me is just an illusion. Anyhow, he said, as I meditated and found myself opening to this continuing upwelling of bliss, what happened was that as my experience at the monastery of the nursing home continued, I was able to shut out the grim, bleak environment and get into a completely internal state of awareness. Then I began to carry that with me when my eyes weren't closed. Actually, it got clear that whether my eyes were open or closed, this consciousness was always there. It's like an infinite vastness inside yourself. The world becomes more real than real. It takes on a higher dimension, so to speak. Coincidentally, he writes, as all this was going on, I was getting better physically. By that time, I'd been in the nursing home for 2 years, and by coincidence, just at that time, a public housing apartment became available. I was able to move out of the nursing home into the apartment. He wrote, I'm living on my own now. I have a helper who comes in the morning to get me dressed and for breakfast, and in the evening for dinner. So that's my answer to your question about what happened to me. It's basically been a good experience. Being paralyzed forced me inward in a radical way, something that never would have happened otherwise. Then he goes through that. He ends the whole thing with this note. He said, so to sum up, Well, I just got this hit like I'm going to cry. If I do, I'm sorry. He said, so to sum up, I'm a quadriplegic. I live in poverty, and I'm the happiest man on earth. And I'm crying, out of just some kind of selfishness, because, I would call Michael, and he would kind of walk me through these experiences, and it was just extraordinary. I published this. I know, many people called him, and he would talk with people and kind of walk them through this stuff. And I got it that this was a very real experience for him. Now, that doesn't mean that there wasn't still a personality there, a personality that could be, upset or angry or unhappy or petulant or, what have you, all those things, come along with being a human being on this earth. There was still Michael. But I'm convinced that what Jesus experienced, what Buddha experienced, what all the great saints experienced, is what Michael experienced, and that it's available to me and to you. We may not know it until the day we die, and I'm certain that we will on that day, but I'm convinced it's real.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 866-987-THOM.
In fact, I'm convinced it's the only reality.